They say destiny never knocks politely. It spills into your life when you're least prepared to catch it. The Grand Moon Banquet had welcomed kings, nobles, generals, and the most powerful wolf clans from every corner of the Northern Territories. Yet for Emily Carter, it was simply another exhausting night of balancing polished silver trays and pretending she didn't exist. Crystal chandeliers stretched across the vaulted ceiling like frozen constellations, scattering warm golden light over polished marble floors that reflected every elegant step taken by guests dressed in embroidered gowns and tailored ceremonial coats. The air carried the comforting scent of roasted herbs, fresh bread, cedarwood, expensive perfume, and the faint sweetness of aged berry wine poured only for those fortunate enough to sit near the royal table. Emily kept her eyes lowered, just as she had been taught since arriving at Blackthorn Palace 6 months earlier. An Omega servant was expected to be invisible. Invisible people did not interrupt conversations. Invisible people did not look directly at nobles. Invisible people certainly never approached the Alpha King unless commanded. She reminded herself of those rules every few minutes, repeating them silently until they became steadier than her own heartbeat. At 23, Emily had learned that surviving was often less about strength and more about remaining unnoticed. She moved gracefully between crowded tables, replacing empty glasses, collecting polished plates, and offering quiet smiles to guests who rarely noticed the young woman carrying their evening in steady hands. Most looked through her as though she were another piece of furniture decorating the magnificent ballroom. She preferred it that way. Attention usually brought trouble. Beyond the towering windows, a full moon illuminated the palace gardens with silver light, making the fountains shimmer like flowing glass. Inside, musicians played gentle strings while nobles exchanged polished laughter that echoed beneath painted ceilings depicting ancient wolves standing beside forgotten queens. Tonight was not merely a celebration. It marked 5 years since Alpha King Adrian. Blackwood united the divided packs under one crown, ending generations of rivalry through wisdom rather than fear. Stories about him traveled farther than the kingdom itself. Some claimed his wolf could silence an entire battlefield with a single roar. Others insisted he had never smiled during a royal ceremony. Emily had no interest in discovering which stories were true. As long as she stayed far from the royal platform, none of those legends belonged to her world. She adjusted the white cuffs of her servant's uniform and carefully lifted another silver tray holding crystal goblets filled with ruby-colored wine. The polished surface reflected her pale skin, soft brown hair gathered into a simple braid, and clear blue eyes that always seemed too curious for someone who worked so hard to disappear. A senior servant hurried past her and whispered sharply without slowing down. "Remember this, Emily. Stay away from the royal aisle. If His Majesty walks by, step aside immediately and never cross his path." Emily nodded instinctively even though the woman was already gone. She had heard similar warnings all week. No one questioned them. Everyone understood that the palace revolved around invisible lines ordinary people were never meant to cross. Trumpets suddenly echoed through the ballroom, their powerful notes cutting through every conversation at once. Hundreds of voices faded into complete silence as enormous oak doors slowly opened. Palace guards dressed in black ceremonial uniforms entered first, their synchronized footsteps echoing across marble before splitting into 2 perfect rows. Every noble bowed their head. Every servant froze exactly where they stood. Emily instinctively lowered her gaze, tightening both hands around the tray until her fingers almost trembled. She could not yet see him, only hear measured footsteps approaching through the silence, calm, confident, impossibly steady. Somehow those footsteps felt heavier than the music, heavier than the palace itself, as though every heartbeat inside the grand hall had unconsciously begun matching the rhythm of one man walking toward the throne, while somewhere across the crowded ballroom, another pair of unseen eyes quietly settled on the young Omega who had spent her entire life believing destiny belonged only to someone else. Emily kept her head lowered as the royal procession crossed the length of the ballroom, but curiosity proved stronger than caution. For only the briefest heartbeat, she allowed herself to glance upward. Alpha King Adrian Blackwood was even more striking than the countless stories whispered throughout the palace corridors. His black ceremonial coat was trimmed with silver thread that caught the chandelier light like moonlight resting on fresh snow. A polished wolf crest gleamed across his chest, and every measured step carried the effortless confidence of a man who had never needed to prove his authority because everyone around him already believed it. Yet it was not power that caught Emily's attention. It was the remarkable stillness surrounding him. Hundreds of nobles smiled, bowed, and whispered with carefully rehearsed elegance, but Adrian walked through them with quiet composure, acknowledging respectful greetings with little more than a slight nod. There was no arrogance in his expression, only discipline that had been practiced for years. Emily immediately lowered her eyes again, embarrassed that she had looked longer than she should have. She reminded herself that the distance between a palace servant and the Alpha King was greater than the distance between the ballroom floor and the stars painted across the ceiling. She carefully continued serving the guests nearest the Western banquet tables, grateful that the royal platform remained several yards away. Beside her, another servant whispered nervously, "Do not look toward the nobles. Lady Victoria Ashcroft has been watching everyone all evening." Emily had heard the name before. Lady Victoria belonged to one of the oldest noble families in the kingdom, admired for her beauty and feared for her pride. Emily quietly nodded and lifted another polished silver tray, carrying 6 crystal goblets filled nearly to the rim with deep crimson wine imported from southern vineyards. The liquid shimmered beneath the candlelight with every careful step she took. Across the room, laughter rose. As musicians changed melodies, and servants moved and practiced rhythm between the crowded tables. For several peaceful minutes, everything unfolded exactly as expected. Then Emily noticed Lady Victoria approaching from the opposite direction. The noblewoman wore a magnificent emerald gown decorated with tiny silver gemstones that sparkled with every graceful movement. Her smile appeared warm enough for nearby guests, yet her sharp green eyes never reflected the same kindness. She exchanged brief greetings with several influential families before slowly changing direction. Emily instinctively stepped aside to give her plenty of room. She lowered her tray slightly and waited respectfully, expecting the noblewoman to pass without incident. Instead, Lady Victoria hesitated for a fraction of a second, glancing toward the approaching royal aisle before taking one perfectly timed step backward. Her elbow brushed Emily's forearm with surprising force. The movement seemed accidental to everyone watching. To Emily, it felt strangely deliberate. The silver tray tilted. Time itself appeared to hesitate. Emily's breath caught as 6 crystal goblets slid across polished metal. She reached desperately with both hands, managing to steady 5 of them. But the 6th continued its impossible journey toward the edge. The glass spun once in the air, catching the golden light before its contents burst forward in a graceful crimson arc. Conversations stopped almost instantly. The rich red wine landed across the front of Adrian Blackwood's ceremonial coat, staining the silver wolf crest resting over his heart. The empty crystal goblet bounced harmlessly across the marble floor before coming to rest near the royal dais with a delicate chime that somehow sounded louder than every trumpet played that evening. Emily stood completely frozen. The tray remained clutched in trembling hands while every color disappeared from her face. Around her, nobles stared with expressions of disbelief too profound for words. Several servants quietly stepped backward as though distance alone could protect them from whatever might happen next. Lady Victoria covered her mouth with elegant surprise, her performance flawless enough to fool nearly everyone present. "How terribly careless," she murmured softly, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Emily wanted to explain, to apologize, to say that she had not lost her balance on her own, but no words came. Her heartbeat thundered inside her ears until it drowned out the music entirely. She slowly lifted her eyes, terrified to meet the gaze of the one man she had been warned never to approach, only to discover that Adrian Blackwood was no longer looking at the stains spreading across his coat. He was looking directly at her, and for reasons she could not begin to understand, his calm silver eyes held neither anger nor disappointment. Instead, something ancient seemed to awaken quietly behind them, as though another presence had recognized her long before either of them realized why. The silence lingered so completely that Emily could hear the faint crackle of candles burning along the ballroom walls. Hundreds of eyes remained fixed upon her, each passing second making the weight of their attention feel heavier than the silver tray still trembling in her hands. She lowered her gaze immediately, her heart pounding so hard she wondered whether everyone around her could hear it. Every lesson she had learned since entering Blackthorn Palace returned at once. A servant who embarrassed the crown did not defend herself. A servant accepted responsibility, offered an apology, and hoped mercy would be stronger than protocol. Emily carefully placed the tray onto a nearby serving table before stepping forward with slow, uncertain movements. Her fingers shook as she folded her hands together to keep them still. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice barely carrying through the enormous hall. "I am deeply sorry. The mistake was mine." Before Adrian could answer, another voice interrupted. "A mistake," Lady Victoria repeated with elegant disbelief. She stepped gracefully into the center of the gathering, her emerald gown sweeping across the polished marble. Carelessness before the Alpha King during the most important banquet of the year cannot simply be dismissed as a mistake. Several nobles quietly nodded in agreement. One elderly lord adjusted his spectacles before adding, "Palace discipline exists for a reason. Standards must be maintained." Another noblewoman sighed dramatically. "If servants become careless before the throne, what example does that set for the kingdom?" Emily remained silent. She wanted desperately to explain what had truly happened, yet accusing a respected noble without proof would only make matters worse. Her mother had once told her that truth did not always arrive first, but it usually arrived eventually. Emily silently prayed that those words would prove true tonight. The captain of the royal guard stepped forward with calm professionalism. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "shall we escort the servant away while a replacement uniform is prepared?" Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he continued looking directly at Emily. His silver eyes remained unreadable, calm enough to unsettle even the most experienced nobles standing nearby. Emily finally dared to meet his gaze for only a moment before quickly lowering her eyes again. Something about his expression confused her. She had expected disappointment, perhaps irritation. Instead, there seemed to be quiet curiosity, as though he were trying to remember something almost forgotten. Lady Victoria gently shook her head with carefully rehearsed sympathy. "The poor girl is clearly overwhelmed," she said, her voice sweet enough to convince anyone who did not know her well. Perhaps she simply was not prepared to serve an occasion of such importance. A few guests murmured their agreement. Emily felt warmth rising to her cheeks, not from embarrassment alone, but from the quiet injustice of hearing someone describe an event so differently from the way it had truly happened. Still, she remained silent. Speaking now would only sound like excuses. Adrian finally took one slow step forward. The movement was so measured that every conversation remaining in the ballroom disappeared once again. He looked briefly down at the crimson stain across his ceremonial coat before returning his attention to Emily. "What is your name?" he asked. The question surprised everyone present. Emily blinked once, almost forgetting how to answer. "Emily Carter, Your Majesty." Adrian repeated her name quietly, almost thoughtfully. Emily Carter. Hearing the Alpha King speak her name sent an unfamiliar chill through the room. Most palace servants spent years without the ruler ever learning who they were. The royal advisor standing beside the throne leaned slightly closer. "Your Majesty," he murmured, "the evening schedule is waiting." Adrian gave the slightest nod, but did not move. Instead, he noticed something else. Emily's breathing had become uneven, not from guilt, but from fear. Her fingers remained tightly intertwined to hide their trembling. She stood perfectly still despite the pressure of hundreds of watchful eyes. There was dignity in the way she accepted blame without protest, and honesty in the sorrow filling her blue eyes. Adrian had spent years judging character across negotiating tables, battlefields, and royal councils. Fear often carried one expression. Deception carried another. What he saw before him did not resemble either. Without warning, a strange warmth stirred deep within his chest. It was subtle at first, almost like the memory of distant sunlight after a long winter. His heartbeat changed rhythm for a single instant. The ancient wolf spirit that had remained peacefully silent throughout the banquet suddenly became alert. Adrian felt it clearly, a quiet awareness unlike anything he had experienced before. The sensation was neither threatening nor painful. It felt astonishingly familiar, as though some invisible thread had been pulled gently across time itself. Emily sensed nothing except the silence stretching longer with every passing heartbeat. But the Alpha King's eyes softened almost imperceptibly as the presence within him whispered a single undeniable truth that neither crown nor reason could yet explain. The strange warmth inside Adrian's chest refused to fade. Instead, it spread with quiet determination, like the first rays of sunrise reaching across a frozen valley. He remained perfectly still, but every instinct sharpened. The sounds of the ballroom seemed farther away, softened beneath an invisible current that only he could sense. His wolf, silent through years of royal ceremonies, political negotiations, and countless public appearances, had awakened without warning. It did not grow restless. It did not challenge him. It simply watched the young woman standing a few feet away with unmistakable recognition. Adrian had experienced his wolf's instincts his entire life, yet never like this. There was no surge of aggression, no warning of danger, only an overwhelming certainty that something extraordinary had just entered his world. Emily lowered herself into a respectful curtsy, hoping the moment would finally end. Every second felt endless beneath the eyes of the kingdom's most powerful families. She wished only to return to the kitchens, disappear into familiar hallways, and convince herself this evening had never happened. Instead, she noticed an unfamiliar sensation brushing across the back of her neck. It felt neither hot nor cold, only strangely gentle, like a breeze moving through leaves before a summer storm. She instinctively reached toward her collar, but stopped herself before her hand could rise. Servants did not fidget before the throne. Across the room, the palace physician frowned slightly. He had served 3 generations of rulers and knew the Alpha King's posture better than almost anyone alive. Adrian's breathing had changed. Only slightly, but enough for experienced eyes to notice. Beside him, the elderly high priestess of the moon temple slowly straightened from her chair. Her silver hair framed a face marked by wisdom rather than age, and her pale eyes remained fixed upon the royal crest embroidered over Adrian's heart. At first, she believed the chandelier light was playing tricks upon her vision. Then she realized it was not reflected light at all. A faint silver glow shimmered beneath the fabric of the Alpha King's ceremonial coat, so subtle that few could notice it, yet undeniably real. Her expression quietly transformed from curiosity into astonishment. "Your Majesty," she whispered almost to herself. Adrian looked down. Beneath the crimson stain left by the spilled wine, a soft silver radiance pulsed once beneath the fabric, then again, brighter than before. The wolf crest, sewn into his coat, appeared almost alive beneath the light. Murmurs spread cautiously among those standing nearest the throne. Several elders exchanged uncertain glances. The palace historian took one careful step forward, unable to hide his surprise. Lady Victoria's confident smile faded for the first time that evening. She stared at the glowing crest with growing unease, unable to understand what she was witnessing. Emily noticed the whispers, but did not dare lift her head completely. She assumed the attention remained fixed upon the damaged royal uniform. Then the strange sensation returned, stronger this time. A delicate warmth spread beneath the skin just below her left collarbone. She inhaled sharply. It did not hurt. If anything, it felt oddly comforting, as though a forgotten memory had quietly found its way home. Without thinking, she placed her fingertips lightly against the fabric covering the sensation. The high priestess saw the movement immediately. Her eyes widened. "Wait," she breathed. "Do not move." Every conversation stopped once again. Emily froze in confusion. Adrian slowly stepped closer, not with urgency, but with careful restraint. The distance between them narrowed to only a few feet. The silver light beneath his coat responded instantly, becoming brighter with every measured step. At that exact moment, a faint shimmer appeared beneath the collar of Emily's simple servant uniform. It lasted only a heartbeat, delicate as moonlight reflected across still water, yet every elder standing near the throne saw it clearly. The high priestess slowly lowered herself to one knee. No one understood why. Several nobles looked at one another in bewilderment before following her gaze back toward the 2 figures standing silently in the center of the ballroom. The ancient woman lifted trembling eyes toward Adrian. "Your Majesty," she said softly, her voice carrying through the silent hall with unexpected clarity. The old records were true. Adrian's heartbeat remained steady, but his wolf answered with quiet certainty inside his soul. It was not demanding. It was not questioning. It already knew. Emily looked from the kneeling priestess to the alpha king, unable to understand why everyone suddenly seemed to be looking at her differently. Then, beneath the fabric resting over her collarbone, the gentle warmth blossomed into a soft silver glow that mirrored the light shining over Adrian's heart. And for the first time in centuries, those who remembered the oldest legends realized they were witnessing the beginning of a destiny no kingdom had expected to see. No one moved. Even the musicians lowered their instruments, sensing that the evening had drifted far beyond the carefully planned celebration. The twin silver glows remained steady, illuminating Adrian's royal crest beneath the dark fabric of his ceremonial coat, while a softer light shimmered beneath the collar of Emily's simple servant uniform. The ballroom, once filled with laughter and conversation, now stood suspended in complete silence, as though the palace itself were waiting for someone to explain the impossible. Emily slowly looked down at the faint radiance beneath her collar, her blue eyes widening with quiet confusion. She had never seen anything like it. She did not understand why the warmth inside her chest felt strangely comforting instead of frightening, or why everyone around her had suddenly forgotten the spilled wine that only moments ago seemed certain to end her position at the palace. Adrian remained composed, yet his attention never left Emily. The unfamiliar certainty inside him continued growing stronger with every passing heartbeat. His wolf was no longer merely awake. It stood peacefully beside his own thoughts, observing the young woman before them with calm recognition that words could not explain. For the first time since inheriting the crown, Adrian realized there were ancient truths even a king had never been taught. The high priestess slowly rose from one knee, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she looked toward the enormous stained glass window overlooking the moonlit gardens. The silver moon shining through the colored glass seemed brighter than before, casting delicate patterns across the marble floor. She closed her eyes for a brief moment, searching memories preserved through decades of sacred study. When she opened them again, quiet certainty had replaced surprise. Many believed the oldest prophecy was only a legend, she said gently, her voice carrying through the silent hall. Our ancestors wrote of a night when destiny would reveal itself not through conquest, nor through royal decree, but through an ordinary moment no one could predict. They recorded that the future queen would be recognized when crimson touched the heart of the Alpha King, and the light of the moon would answer both souls at once. A wave of astonished whispers spread among the elders gathered near the throne. Some exchanged uncertain glances while others struggled to remember passages they had dismissed as symbolic poetry rather than historical truth. The royal historian instinctively reached into his leather satchel and withdrew a weathered journal copied from ancient temple records. His fingers turned fragile pages until they stopped on a faded illustration. He stared at it, then slowly lifted the book toward the high priestess. The image showed two figures standing beneath a full moon, silver light shining over both of their hearts. Lady Victoria's graceful composure began to crack. Her smile disappeared entirely as she noticed the expressions changing throughout the ballroom. Only minutes earlier the nobles had viewed Emily as a careless servant deserving punishment. Now curiosity had replaced judgment, and uncertainty had begun replacing certainty. Several respected elders quietly bowed their heads toward the young Omega without fully understanding why instinct urged them to show respect. Emily took a hesitant step backward. "There must be some mistake," she said softly. "I am only a servant. I have never been part of any prophecy." Her voice carried genuine sincerity, making the silence that followed even heavier. Adrian answered before anyone else could speak. "Sometimes truth arrives before understanding," he said calmly. "We will not decide what this means tonight, but neither will we ignore what everyone here has witnessed." His measured words settled the growing tension without raising his voice. The royal guard relaxed their posture, while palace servants who had expected Emily to be escorted away instead watched in amazement as the Alpha King defended patience over judgment. The high priestess stepped closer to Emily with gentle kindness. "Child," she said, studying the young woman's face as though searching for echoes of forgotten history. "Tell me, have you ever worn a family heirloom around your neck?" Emily hesitated before reaching beneath the collar of her uniform. Hidden beneath the fabric rested a small silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. "I have had this since I was little," she answered quietly. "My parents said it was the only thing left with me when they found me as a baby." The instant the pendant emerged into the moonlight, the silver glow surrounding it brightened, and the ancient symbol engraved upon its surface began reflecting the very same radiance that still pulsed over Adrian's heart, leaving every witness with the unmistakable feeling that the forgotten story of the kingdom had just begun to reveal its first long-hidden chapter. The silver pendant rested quietly in Emily's trembling hand, yet its gentle glow continued to brighten beneath the moonlight pouring through the stained glass windows. Every elder in the ballroom stared at the small crescent-shaped charm with growing disbelief. It looked ordinary enough to any stranger, its edges softened by years of careful handling, but the ancient symbol engraved into its center matched the faded illustration inside the royal historian's weathered journal with astonishing precision. The old scholar slowly approached, his hands shaking as he compared the pendant to the drawing preserved for generations. He looked from the page to the necklace several times before releasing a slow breath. "There can be no coincidence," he whispered. "This seal belonged to House Moonvale." The name echoed through the ballroom like the memory of a forgotten song. Younger nobles exchanged puzzled glances, but the oldest families reacted differently. Their expressions changed from confusion to quiet recognition. House Moonvale had disappeared decades earlier, spoken of only in forgotten records and bedtime stories about a royal bloodline that vanished before most living wolves had been born. Emily looked from one face to another, struggling to understand why everyone suddenly seemed to know something about her that she herself had never heard. "I do not understand," she admitted softly. "My parents never spoke about any noble family. They raised me in a small village. They told me they found me wrapped in a blanket outside their farmhouse during a winter storm." The high priestess listened carefully before exchanging a thoughtful glance with Adrian. "Perhaps they told you everything they knew," she replied gently. "Finding a child is not the same as knowing where that child truly came from." Emily lowered her eyes toward the pendant resting in her palm. For as long as she could remember, it had been nothing more than a keepsake reminding her that she had once belonged somewhere unknown. She had never imagined it could carry the weight of history. Adrian stepped closer, his voice remaining calm enough to steady the growing uncertainty filling the hall. "No one will force answers tonight," he said. "Truth deserves patience." Emily looked up at him, surprised once again by the kindness in his words. Every expectation she had carried into the banquet had told her that the Alpha King would be distant and unapproachable. Instead, he spoke with quiet fairness, offering certainty where others offered judgment. The warmth beneath his royal crest still answered the faint glow surrounding her pendant, creating an invisible connection that neither of them could explain. The royal historian carefully closed his journal. "If House Moonvale truly survived through this young woman," he said, "then the palace archives may contain records hidden from public history." There were rumors that the final heirs were protected before the family disappeared. Lady Victoria remained perfectly still, but her thoughts raced behind her composed expression. The evening she had planned to use for humiliating an insignificant servant was transforming into something far more dangerous. If Emily truly carried the blood of an ancient royal house, then everything within the kingdom could begin to change. Across the ballroom, the full moon climbed higher above Blackthorn Palace, bathing the marble floor in pale silver light. Emily quietly closed her fingers around the pendant, feeling for the first time that the unanswered questions she had carried since childhood were no longer distant mysteries. Somewhere within the forgotten history of the kingdom, someone already knew her name, and before the night came to an end, the search for that long-buried truth would begin. The atmosphere inside the Grand Moon Banquet had changed beyond recognition. The spilled wine, the whispered accusations, and the frightened silence had all faded into the background. Every conversation now revolved around one impossible question. Who was Emily Carter? The nobles no longer looked at the young servant with casual dismissal. Their eyes carried uncertainty, curiosity, and for the first time, respect mixed with caution. Emily could feel those changing expressions following her wherever she stood, and the attention made her more uncomfortable than the earlier criticism ever had. She had spent her life trying not to be noticed. Now the entire kingdom seemed unable to look away. Adrian slowly turned toward the gathered council members and noble families. His calm expression never changed, yet his presence alone quieted every whisper before a single word was spoken. "This banquet was called to celebrate unity," he said in his steady voice. "We will not allow fear, rumors, or assumptions to divide us tonight." His words settled over the ballroom like a welcome calm after a gathering storm. Several elders lowered their heads in agreement. The captain of the royal guard stepped closer, awaiting instructions. Adrian glanced briefly toward Emily before addressing him. "From this moment forward, Miss Emily Carter is under royal protection until the truth surrounding her identity has been fully examined." A ripple of astonishment moved through the hall. Royal protection was an honor almost never granted to someone outside the noble houses, especially not to a palace servant. Lady Victoria's composed smile disappeared completely. She stepped forward with careful elegance, making certain her voice sounded respectful. "Your Majesty," she said gently, "surely. Granting such extraordinary protection before the investigation is complete may encourage unnecessary speculation." Adrian met her gaze without the slightest hint of irritation. "Speculation begins when innocent people are left unprotected," he replied calmly. "Justice begins when they are given the opportunity to discover the truth." His answer left no room for argument. Even those who privately questioned the decision could not openly challenge the fairness behind his reasoning. Emily looked at him in quiet disbelief. She had expected dismissal, perhaps punishment, certainly not protection. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I do not wish to cause trouble for anyone." Adrian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "You did not create tonight's events," he answered. "They found you." The simple sentence settled deeply within her heart. For years, Emily had blamed herself whenever life became difficult, believing that somehow she always stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hearing someone as respected as the Alpha King separate her from the chaos surrounding her felt strangely comforting. The High Priestess smiled with quiet approval before turning toward the royal historian. "At first light," she instructed, "open every sealed archive concerning House Moonvale. Search every genealogy, every forgotten record, every royal decree. If destiny has chosen this night to reveal its first chapter, we must honor it with truth rather than fear." The historian bowed immediately. "It will be done." Palace servants quietly approached Adrian with a fresh ceremonial coat, but before accepting it, he carefully removed the stained garment and handed it to one of his attendants. The silver glow beneath the royal crest had faded, yet the memory of it remained vivid in every witness's mind. Emily instinctively glanced down at the crescent pendant resting against her hand. Its gentle light had also disappeared, leaving only polished silver beneath the moonlight. Yet somehow she knew the change had not ended. It had only paused. As the banquet slowly resumed with cautious conversation instead of celebration, no one noticed a lone figure standing near the highest balcony, overlooking the ballroom. Hidden behind carved stone pillars, an elderly palace steward quietly watched Emily with eyes filled not with surprise, but with recognition. He whispered only 4 words beneath his breath, words no one else was close enough to hear. She finally came home. The celebration continued only in appearance. Music returned, servants resumed carrying polished trays, and conversation slowly filled the magnificent ballroom once more, but no one spoke about trade agreements or harvest festivals anymore. Every whispered discussion circled back to Emily Carter, the mysterious pendant, and the ancient name that had unexpectedly returned from history. Emily stood quietly beside one of the tall palace windows, watching moonlight shimmer across the gardens beyond the glass. She still wore the same servant uniform she had put on before sunrise, yet nothing about the evening felt familiar anymore. She barely recognized the young woman reflected in the window. Just hours earlier, she had worried about serving dinner without making a mistake. Now respected elders had spoken to her with reverence. The Alpha King had placed her under royal protection, and forgotten legends had somehow become part of her own life. She wrapped her fingers gently around the crescent pendant beneath her collar. searching for answers that remained just beyond reach. Soft footsteps approached across the marble floor. Emily turned to find Adrian walking toward her without the crowd of advisors and guards that usually surrounded him. The conversations nearest the window immediately became quieter, though everyone respectfully kept their distance. Adrian stopped a few feet away, allowing the silence between them to remain comfortable rather than awkward. "How are you feeling?" he asked. Emily offered a small, uncertain smile. "Confused, Your Majesty." His expression softened with quiet understanding. "So am I." The honesty in his answer surprised her. Kings were expected to possess certainty, not admit uncertainty before others. Yet Adrian spoke without hesitation, reminding her once again that the stories told about him had never captured the man standing before her. "I have spent years studying the history of this kingdom," he continued. "Tonight, I discovered there are chapters even the crown has not yet read." Emily lowered her eyes thoughtfully. "If everything they believe is true, then my entire life began with a question no one could answer." Adrian nodded. "Then we will search for the answer together." Before Emily could respond, the elderly palace steward stepped carefully from the shadows near the grand staircase. His silver hair and weathered face reflected decades of faithful service, and every royal advisor immediately recognized him as Thomas Whitmore, the oldest living member of the palace household. He bowed respectfully before Adrian. "Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty, but I believe the time has come to speak." Adrian gestured for him to continue. Thomas looked toward Emily with unmistakable warmth. "Many years ago," he began quietly, "on the coldest winter night I can remember, I was instructed to deliver supplies to the eastern gate before sunrise. There I found a carriage waiting in silence. A woman placed a sleeping infant into my arms along with a silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon. She begged me to ensure the child would live, no matter what happened afterward." Emily felt her breath catch. "You were there?" Thomas slowly nodded. "I was." Every nearby conversation faded once again as listeners realized the old steward was revealing memories buried for more than 2 decades. "The woman never gave her name," he continued. "Before leaving, she said only one sentence that I have never forgotten." He looked directly into Emily's eyes. "When the moon calls her home, she will not need anyone to tell her who she is, because the kingdom itself will remember." Tears quietly gathered in Emily's eyes, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming realization that the first true piece of her past had finally emerged. Adrian remained beside her, his steady presence offering reassurance without a single unnecessary word. Around them, the palace seemed to breathe differently, as though ancient walls that had guarded forgotten secrets for generations were finally preparing to reveal everything they had protected for so long. The final notes of the orchestra drifted gently through the Grand Moon Banquet as guests slowly stepped onto the palace terrace beneath the brilliant full moon. What had begun as a celebration of past victories had quietly become the beginning of an entirely different story, one no historian, noble, or servant could have predicted. Emily stood beside the marble balcony, the cool night breeze carrying the scent of pine and blooming white roses through the royal gardens below. She looked across the kingdom stretching beyond the palace walls, wondering how a single unexpected moment had changed everything she believed about herself. Only hours earlier she had entered the ballroom, hoping to remain unnoticed. Now she carried a name connected to forgotten history and a future filled with questions waiting to be answered. She gently held the silver crescent pendant in her hand. It no longer felt like the last reminder of a life without answers. It felt like the first key to discovering who she had always been. Adrian stepped beside her, his eyes following the moonlight resting across the quiet valley below. Neither of them rushed to speak. The silence between them carried an unexpected sense of peace, as though destiny itself understood that some journeys deserved to begin slowly. At last Adrian turned toward her with the same calm sincerity that had remained unchanged throughout the evening. "Whatever the archives reveal tomorrow," he said softly, "you will not face it alone." Emily looked into his silver eyes and, for the first time since arriving at Blackthorn Palace, felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. She felt safe, not because every mystery had been solved, but because someone had chosen compassion before judgment. She smiled, small but genuine. "Thank you, Your Majesty." Adrian returned the smile with quiet warmth. Perhaps one day, he replied. You will simply call me Adrian. Nearby, the high priestess watched them with peaceful satisfaction while the elderly steward Thomas Whitmore gazed toward the moonlit sky. The oldest prophecy had never promised an easy road. It had promised that when the right hearts finally met, an age of fear would slowly give way to an age of hope. Across the terrace, nobles who had once dismissed Emily now bowed respectfully as she passed. None of them fully understood what tomorrow would bring, yet every one of them sensed that the kingdom had witnessed the first page of a new chapter. The spilled wine that had seemed like a disaster only hours before had become the unexpected moment that awakened forgotten truths, restored buried memories, and reminded everyone that destiny often arrives through ordinary acts no one could ever plan. As the full moon climbed higher above Blackthorn Palace, its silver light rested equally upon a king, a servant, and a future still waiting to unfold, proving that true greatness is never measured by titles alone, but by kindness, courage, and the willingness to see the worth hidden within another soul before the rest of the world does. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and share it with someone who believes that kindness can change destiny. We would also love to hear from you in the comments. Do you think Emily is truly the last heir of House Moonvale? And what secret do you believe the royal archives will reveal next?